I'm delighted to welcome you to a special lecture delivered by Professor Stefanie Middendorf entitled Notions of Emergency under Democratic and Dictatorial Rule. Professor Middendorf is currently Professor of Modern and Contemporary History at the Friedrich Schiller University in Jena. She's a visiting fellow of the Oxford Martin Programme on the Changing Global Orders project. Currently, she's a research member of the steering committee of the Excellence Cluster Project Imaginamics at the University of Jena and an editor of the Vierteljahre-Hefte für Zeitgeschichte, which is one of the most important modern history journals published in Germany. Her research focuses on the history of National Socialism and the Holocaust, emergency rule and state violence in comparative perspectives. She's also published widely on European and French cultural history, the experience of crises, the history of capitalism and colonialism, and German Jewish history in the long 20th century. Especially significant for the Changing Global Orders project is her prize-winning monograph Macht der Ausnahme, Reichsfinanzministerium und Staatlichkeit, 1919 to 1945. So Power of Exception, the Reichsfinanzministry and Statecraft in the first half of the 20th century. And she's also published an important book on mass culture, perception of social modernity in France from the late 19th to the late 20th century. We look forward very much to the lecture, Stefanie, and it's over to you. Many thanks.
Thank you so much, Patricia, for the invitation, and also the Oxford Martin School for this splendid fellowship and for the opportunity to present on my thoughts on notions of emergency under democratic and dictatorial rule. I will focus on the French and the German cases mainly during my lecture, but I will start with a more recent and a different case with the situation in the US. He who saves his country does not violate any law. This quote is attributed to Napoleon Bonaparte and was posted by Donald Trump 1 month ago on X and on his own platform, Truth Social. It sparked immediate criticism, especially by the Democrats, for example, by Californian Senator Adam Schiff, who stated that Trump had spoken like a true dictator. Trump's claim is reminiscent not only of Napoleon's self-empowerment as a revolutionary leader, but also of the justification of the Hitler regime by the right-wing conservative constitutional lawyer Carl Schmitt. In an essay in the Deutsche Juristenzeitung in 1934, Schmitt claimed the Führer protects the law. In this text, Schmitt adopted Hitler's propagandistic statement that the German Reich had failed in the First World War due to the weaknesses of its prerogative state. Because, according to Hitler, as quoted by Schmitt, and I quote him, at the decisive moment, it, the Reich, did not have the strength to make use of his martial laws. Schmitt went on stating, and I quote again, paralyzed by the way of thinking of a liberal constitutional state, a politically uninstinct civil bureaucracy did not have the courage to treat mutineers and enemies of the state according to deserved justice. So this was the anti-liberal and anti-democratic hate speech of Adolf Hitler and Carl Schmitt against the German legal state order in 1934. And that little he reminds us probably of Trump's agitation against public administration and the supposedly excessive bureaucracy intended to justify the arbitrary dismissal of civil servants. Schmitt's text also recalls the contemptuous tone of the stronger against the weaker, which Trump, Vance, Musk, and other current members or supporters of the American government are using. But Schmitt is not only the intellectual claqueur of the early 1930s and thus of the Nazi era. He is also famously known as the state theorist of the 1920s, whose definition of the state of exception remains influential to this day. Sovereign is he who decides on the state of exception, wrote Schmitt in his 1922 Political Theology that you can see here in its second edition from 1934. Shortly after the First World War, Schmitt's text provided a slogan that still resonates today and can be found in all kinds of articles and lectures, and of course, including my own, on states of emergency or crisis. The power of this short phrase lies in the fact that it vividly imagines a decisive act. It is claimed that from this act alone, without further preconditions and without dependence on others, an absolute sovereignty can be achieved. This is at least how Schmitt imagined the state of exception, the Ausnahmezustand, as a state that exists beyond the law and at the same time establishes new law. In his early work in the 1920s, in a moment of fragile stability of the young Weimar democracy, Schmitt at least took the possible limitation of sovereign power by the applicable law still into account. 12 years later, in 1934, he declared that the act of the Führer could no longer be grasped by any legalizing categories. The Hitler regime, Schmitt claimed, was neither under siege nor in a state of emergency or in a state of exception. In his eyes, the Führerstaat would never return to such constitutional categories of a bygone era. For the moment, I would like to postpone the question of whether Schmitt's fantasies of a Führer's will unleashed from law were adequately describing the National Socialist reality in 1934. What seems more important to me to do first is to observe how Schmitt justified state sovereignty. He did it namely from the experience of war. For Schmitt, the sovereign state was a state at war. So governing was fundamentally a form of warfare. The state of emergency, as Schmitt imagined it, did not serve to secure peace or to overcome a critical situation, but was intended to restore a state's ability to wage war and thus survive. The distinction between friend and foe, which Schmitt elevated to a fundamental principle of the political in his oeuvre, continued the military division between ally and opponent. For this reason, the National Socialist Führerstaat was, in Schmitt's view, something quite different from a temporary exceptional rule or a constitutional dictatorship. He celebrated it as a return to an open state of war without this being explicitly declared. The seductiveness of this idea of unfettered, unbridled power and absolute sovereignty has now caught up with us again and on a global level. The dictatorial temptation that goes with it can be observed worldwide. This applies not only to the US, where Trump, to the standing ovations of his supporters at the inauguration, declared a national emergency and has since tried to override existing law with a wave of executive orders. In South Korea, in Gaza, and also in parts of Europe, rule by emergency methods is omnipresent. In response to Trump's actions, former French Prime Minister Dominique Villepin recently called for a corresponding European measure. Europe, Villepin said, must declare a state of emergency of its own in response to the disruptive policy of permanent shocks that Trump is pursuing. The state of emergency, the état d'urgence, Villepin was referring to was meant to defend, not challenge, an existing order that sees itself as a decidedly post-war and peace-oriented order. But Villepin's claim, and I will come back to this later, was also rooted in specific experiences with the stating of emergencies in the French Republic. So what does the declaration of states of exception, martial law, or emergency regimes mean? Does a state of emergency presage the advent of a dictatorship or the salvation of democracy? Why do the boundaries between these very different options appear to be so fluid? Are such developments part of a global policy or primarily an expression of national paths? And what answer to these questions does the history of the 20th century provide, in which the state of exception gained significance and took on different forms that continue to have an effect on our present? I will, of course, not be able to answer all these questions. However, I would like to try some approaches by focusing on the German and the French examples. And I will organize my presentation not as a coherent historical narrative, but by following 4 different perspectives. The first one being the situatedness of the concept of emergency rule within the history of modernity. As already indicated, and as you can see by this Google Ngram research, the concept of emergency is similar to the concept of crisis, omnipresent, and seems to be of particular importance for the self-description of our present. The term state of exception and corresponding concepts like the state of emergency and the state of siege experienced a first heyday in the interwar period, but a lasting boom was triggered at the turn to the 21st century. This boom also resulted from the fact that in the 1990s, 94% of the conflicts carried out with the use of weapons were internal conflicts or conflicts in areas without a fixed state order and no longer classical wars between nation states. According to a 1997 report prepared for the United Nations, between 1985 and 1997, about 100 states or territories, that is more than half of the member states of the United Nations, were at some point in some kind of a state of emergency. Since then, a perspective has become established, drawing on the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben, that understands the state of exception as a paradigm of government in the present. Under this paradigmatic framing, the most diverse regions and periods are drawn together into one historical narrative, calling for describing the current situation as a global civil war, and leading from the Nazi concentration camps to the practices of protective custody in Guantanamo, from colonial counterinsurgency to the waiting zone, the zone d'attente for migrants at French airports. The historical origin and the model for this kind of state of exception is situated in the moment of transition between the Weimar democracy and the Nazi dictatorship, which Agamben calls a legalized civil war. So he lumps the democratic emergency measures before 1933 and the dictatorial practices of violence afterwards in Germany together into a linear story. In this historically questionable connection, they are then elevated to a model for all subsequent developments, which allegedly continue to shape and guide European democracies to this day. Or in Agamben's own words, the entire politico-constitutional life of Western societies began gradually to assume a new form, which has perhaps only today reached its full development. Agamben places the concentration camp, or the camp in general, at the center of his argument, defining it as the essential political space of our present. For it is there in the camps, he argues, that the modern state of emergency materialized and finally stabilized as a spatial institution. Agamben sees the National Socialist concentration camps as symbolizing the state of exception, and he accordingly labels Auschwitz as the political model for all regimes that established camps of whatever kind in the 20th and early 21st centuries. In doing so, he also implicates that the National Socialists had only continued what the Weimar democracy had begun, and that the liberal states after 1945 in turn continued what the Nazi regime had tried out. What Agamben achieves by this is the blurring of historical differences between democratic and dictatorial rule. Violence in dictatorship appears as a radicalization of democratic violence, not as something fundamentally different. So no categorical differences are seen between liberal and illiberal regimes either. Both variants are placed in a continuum of European modernism. They are both read as the result of a bourgeois logic of progress that normalizes the state of exception and turns it into a permanent security state. I would like to try and question this perspective, and in order to do so, I will now discuss the conceptual origins of the state of exception in modernity, which do not lie in the 1930s of the 20th century, where Agamben, as an avid reader of Carl Schmitt, primarily locates them, but rather point back to a longer history. In the following, I would also like to show the differences and ruptures between democratic and dictatorial emergencies, and in turn to distinguish these forms from totalitarian rule. The history of emergency rule did not begin in the 20th century. What we understand conceptually as an emergency in the modern sense is rooted in the upheavals of the French Revolution and the attempted civilization and de facto politicization of French martial law in the 19th century. The French decree of 1791 that defined the modern état de siège, the state of siege, described the liminality between peace and war. This state of siege, from which the state of exception and the state of emergency later emerged as individual concepts, was the state of affairs in which, and I quote the decree, military needs and purposes dominate all other considerations to such an extent that for the civilian population as well, military force, martial law, and cause martiale wholly or partially replace civil law and the normal judicial and administrative authorities. Depending on the spatial extent of this state of affairs and against whom it was directed, it could either lead to a so-called military state of siege or serve primarily to combat uprisings in limited territories, which was then labeled as a political state of siege, thus assuming a quasi-demilitarized character. Thus, the state of siege did not explicitly declare war, but rather created an analogy of war in internal spaces, which allowed for the comprehensive suspension of normal civil authorities. In France, the state of siege that emerged from the revolution was later formalized into a republican legal institute by laws that were passed in 1849 and 1878. It was not until the Second World War, in the context of the War of Decolonization in Algeria, that this setting was fundamentally changed again, then under the influence of the German experiences in the early 20th century. So I will come back to the French case later. For Germany, the Prussian law on the state of siege of 1851 was decisive, and it remained influential well into the 20th century. In this state of siege, executive power was transferred from the king or emperor to military authorities. Potentially, this could become a state of the whole nation, meaning without regional limitation. But the exceptional rules that were imposed on individual districts in the German Reich on the basis of the anti-socialist laws in 1878 were therefore referred to as a minor state of siege, and it is this minor state of siege that is mocked as a fake militarization of everyday citizen behavior that is mocked in this German cartoon from the same year. The German state of exception, as not primarily military but as a decidedly political state, was only invented and tested with the rise of mass democracy after the First World War. The German Constitution of 1919 provided for the authorization of the Reichspräsident in situations that endangered public security and order. This step led to the concept of the state of siege being permanently removed from the German constitution and replaced by the state of exception. Unfortunately, this constitutional regulation remained rather vague. De facto, it was an attempt at civilizing the state of exception, which increasingly took on a social-political character and could reach all areas of life: economic, social, cultural, and mental. Since 1919, enabling acts regulated countless aspects of everyday life, from financial and labor market politics, social welfare and food security, to trade relations, demobilization, or the consumption of alcohol, as in the Notgesetz, the emergency law against feasting and usury you can see on the slide. Between 1919 and 1925 alone, well over 400 such emergency authorizations were issued, mostly with the approval of parliamentary majorities. This also affected the accommodation of migrants, for example, in various protective custody camps in Prussia and Bavaria in the early 1920s, from whose archives the foreigner ID card you can see here has been taken. The German state of exception thus moved closer to a broader concept of crisis. A new style of exceptional power emerged, as a contemporary observer put it, which was associated less with a state of war than with a general state of turbulence or turmoil. In practice, in the German case, this state of exception proved to be an authoritarian mode of rule that could be used to establish a different social order, if the sovereign will was radical enough. But in that political and transformative sense, it only became a mode of transition to dictatorship when in July 1932, the right-wing Chancellor Franz von Papen dismissed the social democratic government in Prussia during the so-called Preußenschlag, which is announced here on that photograph, by using exceptional powers. However, the Weimar state of exception also provided a laboratory and a reservoir of experience for more stable democratic regimes, such as France, especially after the Second World War. Coming to my third perspective, the concept of state of emergency, or in German Staatsnotstand, no longer Ausnahmezustand, that emerged after 1945 in various European societies at about the same time, took up from there, but represented a lasting transformation. It reinvented emergencies as a state that connected and entangled different historical experiences and realms. As a technique of government and power, it was now closely linked to the Cold War and to decolonization. During this period, the definition of the state of war on the level of international and humanitarian law changed. Actually, the concept of war was increasingly avoided. Instead, various types of international armed conflicts were described, which did not need to be carried out between states. This reflected, of course, changes in modern warfare in the wave of decolonization wars after 1945. At the same time, this change was associated with the emergence of a humanitarian interventionism that was designed to enable operations on what were actually sovereign domains. These developments also changed the ways in which the state of emergency was conceived in periods of peace. Moreover, the scope for action during emergencies that came up as a result was no longer regulated at the national level alone, but internationally, as it included a system of reporting to the UN. These developments in the second half of the 20th century can be observed especially in the context of the French and British decolonization conflicts, and I will concentrate, as I said, on the French case. Since after World War II, the history of emergencies changed its main residency, leaving the German Reich, which collapsed in 1945, and entered into a new era in the collapsing colonial territories. It also moved from the prehistory of total dictatorship to its post-history. It was obvious that the totalitarian forms of rule that had characterized the Nazi dictatorship still had a lasting effect, which could relate not only different epochs and temporal layers to one another, but also touched on different geographical realms. So the experiences of the Nazi era shaped the perspective on what happened under the concept of emergency rule after 1945, since the Nazi dictatorship was interpreted as a radicalization of the democratic states of exception of the 1930s. In West Germany, the emergency laws of the late 1960s were contested as the return of the total state. The threat of the totale Notstandstaat, as in this book by Eugen Kogon, a survivor of Nazi camps, and other former anti-national socialists and left liberals that you can see here on the slide. In the United Kingdom, anti-colonial activists accused their government of using Gestapo tactics in the decolonization struggles in Kenya. And in France, survivors of Nazi camps such as David Rousset and Germain Tillion not only campaigned against the Stalinist Gulag, but also voiced their experiences in order to protest against the internment camps that were legitimized by the French state of emergency in Algeria. Announced by the media As you can see in these press reports, in April 1955, the French National Assembly had for the first time declared this newly conceived état d'urgence, the state of emergency, beginning in the trans-Mediterranean departments of Kabila and Ores. The justification for the corresponding law on special powers pointed out that its language and methods of compulsory residence were intended to avoid the creation of the world of barbed wire camps that was still all too familiar from totalitarianism. The term accommodation centers, centres d'hébergement, was therefore implemented in an euphemistic manner. In effect, these so-called accommodation centers functioned as something resembling prisoner of war installations in the Algerian decolonization war for a war that could not speak its name. Unwilling to recognize the Algerian rebels as combatants under international law, France made use of administrative internment as it struggled to regain control of the territory. In February 1959, Michel Roucas, a young inspector of the French administration in Algeria, who later served as prime minister under President François Mitterrand, submitted a confidential report denouncing the outrageous conditions in these camps. The document was leaked to the media. In the aftermath of this media scandal, an emergency resettlement program was launched during the 1,000 villages, the 1000 villages, expanding a second camp structure that had been developed next to the accommodation centers and that was called assembly camps, in French, camps de regroupement. The hypocrisy and the associated acts of violence related to this French universe of camps triggered the resistance by survivors of Nazi terror, as I have already mentioned shortly. However, these former resistance fighters soon distanced themselves from an interpretation that linked these developments directly to the Nazi regime. They abandoned the equation of French camps with Auschwitz because they found it neither politically helpful nor analytically accurate. Rather, this simplistic comparison with the Holocaust obscured the specifics of the emergence and implementation of state violence in Algeria in the 1950s and 60s, and thus prevented an adequate critique. Germain Tillion, for example, a former inmate of Ravensbrück concentration camp, pointed out that because of this narrowing of perspective, too little attention was paid to torture as a defining instrument of emergency warfare in France. At the same time, the most important sites for the forced modernization of Algerian society through population transfer, which were the civilian assembly camps, the camps de regroupement, not the internment camps, were made almost invisible because they served technocratic social engineering purposes that were very different from those of the Nazi concentration camps. 2.7 million people were interned in these camps and suffered from violence, hunger, and poor hygiene compared to a few tens of thousands of people who were forcibly detained in the accommodation centers, the centres d'hébergement. It was thus evident that equating the French regime with the total dictatorship of the Nazi state, as Agamben does it, did not explain or shed light on the French techniques of violence and domination, but obscured them and their specific genealogy. The French example also shows that the declaration of a state of emergency was now taking place in a globalized legal setting. Unlike the colonial wars of the 19th century, unlike the crisis governance of the interwar period, and very unlike the rare National Socialist state of exception declared in occupied territories during the Second World War. Declaring a state of emergency after 1945 offered the opportunity to circumvent the provisions of the Geneva Convention and to shield the war in Algeria as internal disturbance within a sovereign state against external criticism or intervention. Against this background, one of the editors of the clandestine collection of testimonies on torture from the Algerian War, which was published in France in 1959 under the title La Gangrène, put it this way: strict laws were enacted to protect prisoners of war, but not anyone can be a belligerent. Your adversary must still consider it in his interest to recognize you as such. As for the rebel, he cannot benefit from the guarantees of international law. On this basis, the état d'urgence established in several steps in Algeria both avoided declaring an inner state of war and extended itself beyond the fight against resistance under the traditional state of siege. What is even more important, it was labeled to secure a common good or a good life, to reduce inequalities and implement reforms as a means to weaken Algerian nationalism. For this reason, too, the corresponding arsenal of governmental interventions, like the strategy of regroupement, could be used to frame even brutal measures of counterinsurgency as socio-political interventions of the French welfare state. In the parliamentary discussion about the état d'urgence, the French rapporteur, Jacques Janton, accordingly claimed that the newly established state of emergency was no longer a liminal situation between war and peace. Instead, he claimed it to embody an idea of political and social modernity that needed to be secured or brought about for the future. This state of emergency functioned, Janton argued, as an intermediary between a normal situation and a state of siege. This emphasis on normality and welfare state obligation, as well as the normative recourse to modernity, were new elements that had not previously appeared in the debates on exceptional powers. In some of their elements, they referred back to the socio-political complexity of the German-style Ausnahmezustand of the 1920s and 30s. Yet they were not meant to deal with a crisis. They were intended to legitimize new methods of warfare in the colonies that claimed to be a modernizing effort, not a war. In doing so, they opened up spaces for new kinds of warfare, not in violation of, but backed by international law and human rights regimes. The state of emergency in the context of a global order after 1945 thus required approaches, language, and tactics that differed from the state of exception in the Weimar democracy and under the conditions of a totalitarian Führerstaat during the Second World War. The experience of the global war had fundamentally changed the framework of emergency rule and the effectiveness of such measures. The practices of detention, guarding, and sealing off, which the French government resorted to, emerged under the still fresh impression of the totalitarian violence of National Socialism and Stalinism, and at the same time under the new conditions of an international order that was built up in reaction to a global war. In France, this change was expressed in the fact that exceptional powers were legitimized by a newly created method of emergency rule, not by the techniques that had existed before. These new emergencies cut across the borders of nationally defined realms and circulated between territories. They could be transferred back to metropolitan areas and served various governments in the course of the 20th century as a reservoir of knowledge. As my fourth and final perspective, I would now like to return for a moment to the totalization of the state of exception in Germany and to Carl Schmitt. In the course of the 20th century, France frequently made use of its specific state of emergency to deal with political, social, or economic problems, usually reporting its procedures to the UN in accordance with the specification of international humanitarian law. This situation was very different from the German case. As I have shortly indicated, after the Second World War, a constitutional solution was found in West Germany that incorporated emergency rule into the German Grundgesetz in 1968. However, this instrument has never been applied in the form provided for, quite unlike in France. The experiences of the Nazi dictatorship might explain this German hesitation, and I would therefore like to give this a thought before coming to the conclusion. Around 1941, the immigrant German political scientist Ernst Fraenkel wrote in his book The Dual State that by the declaration of the Reichstagsbrandverordnung, the so-called Reichstags Fire Decree of February 1933, what he's termed civil state of exception, had become the constitutional charter of the Third Reich. The Nazis had undermined the existing legal order, but despite all their revolutionary energy, did not delete it, Franke argued. In fact, a specific historical combination of a prerogative state and a normative state emerged from this. So the Weimar state of exception seemed to be perpetuated, even though also the famous Enabling Act, which was voted by a frightened parliament in March 1933, had to be regularly extended between 1933 and 1943, meaning that it did not simply apply without a temporal limit. In 1937, it was prolonged for 4 years until 1941, then in 1939 until 1943, when finally a Führer decree, a Führererlass, exempted the Enabling Act from any limitation in time. But by the time this Führer decree was issued, the state of exception that had been created by the Weimar Republic had totally lost its meaning. Its counter-image, a political, social, and legal state of the normal order, had long disappeared. The National Socialist leadership was no longer concerned with a temporary suspension of an existing normative realm. Hitler, Goebbels, and other leading National Socialists did radically negate the necessity of sharing power or legitimizing violence through any kind of regulated acclamation. So, as Carl Schmitt observed at the time, the Nazi regime was not in a state of exception. It was not considered and implemented as an interim or an abnormality. And for this reason, it was, at least in Schmitt's view, not even a dictatorship. Like many right-wing conservatives, Schmitt experienced the Nazi state as a long overdue relief, a total liberation from the rule of law. For this reason, Schmitt wrote in 1936 in the text you can see here that one could not adequately understand National Socialism with the modern buzzwords of democracy or dictatorship. Only weak European democracies still needed to resort to dictatorial measures, Schmitt stated. Only liberal democracies like Great Britain or France were forced to declare states of exception, to impose martial law or enable governments to undermine the separation of powers during moments of severe crisis. The German Führerstaat, Schmitt insisted, had long left these calamities of modernism behind. And in this way, Schmitt intellectually legitimized what Adolf Hitler claimed before the Reichstag that very same year, that he was not a dictator but a leader. This was, of course, apologetic, and yet Schmitt captured an important point. He pointed to the potential decoupling of state power from the framework of legality and to the transformative power associated with this move, especially in territories whose status as a state was still uncertain or in a state of flux. Unlike the situation in the First World War, no states of exception or siege were declared on the territory of the so-called German Reich, Altreich, between 1933 and 1945. After the war began, a handful of states of siege or exception was imposed on conquered territories such as Poland, Norway, or Denmark. But these declarations rather took up classical techniques of warfare in the pre-modern sense. The genuine methods of the totalitarian terror state did not require the invention or declaration of states of exception. In particular, in the most violent zones of National Socialist extermination politics, in the camps of Auschwitz, Sobibor, or Belzec, the implementation of such states was not necessary. From a very different political point of view than Schmitt's, and long after the end of the Second World War, German Jewish philosopher Hannah Arendt therefore also pointed out that, and I quote her here, totalitarian forms of rule and ordinary dictatorial forms of rule, including the declaration of states of exception, are not the same. In the old Roman sense of the word, dictatorship always meant an emergency measure of constitutional and legal rule. It was always strictly limited in time and power, Arendt argued. This form of a contained dictatorship, that is, a limited state of exception, was not even accessible to the eyes. And this photo here from the extermination camp of Auschwitz had to be taken secretly by one of the inmates. Instead, in this total state, criminal injustice had become the established law. So Arendt made it clear that she considered National Socialist rule a historically unprecedented form of sovereign power that detached itself from the historical continuum of states of exception. In the end, the history of the National Socialist regime, which transformed an authoritarian regime into a totalitarian one, does point to the dynamics of emergency and to the tipping points between democracy and dictatorship. However, it goes also beyond that, as it shows the limits of the explanatory power of such concepts when it comes to the history of radical annihilation and the interpretation of Auschwitz. And I will now come to some concluding remarks. Emergencies were particularly necessary where state violence was still subject to external control at the national and international level, as in the liberal democracies of Europe. In these societies, the experience of Nazi warfare continued to have an impact after 1945, necessitating adjustments and reconceptualizations of emergency rule. On this basis, and in view of the destabilization of their own empires, the European colonial powers further developed the state of emergency into a program of authoritarian modernization in the territories under their control. In addition to the experiences of the enabling regimes of the 1930s and the reverberations of Nazi occupation during the Second World War in European societies, the establishment of international law after 1945 was important for this. The international order created after the end of the Second World War allowed for humanitarian intervention, but at the same time limited the abilities of states to act in the context of war. It thus became necessary to describe, legitimize, and externally justify state violence in war zones differently. The current boom in emergency, on the other hand, seems to herald the return of open warfare and the collapse of the global order. It seems that the absolute sovereignty of states is again being decided in war. In this respect, a comparison with the 1930s and the political options that emerged from it makes sense. However, the focus should maybe be more on analyzing the authoritarian promises of illiberal and potentially totalitarian regimes and less on the critique or self-critique of liberal states. These two paths in the history of the state of emergency are not just two variants of a common modern logic of progress and exceptional power. They represent fundamentally conflicting options. This is arguably also true in the present, where the confrontation between Villepin's call for a European emergency to secure the existing international system and Trump's totalization of emergency rule to enable a national vision is posing us new questions. In my opinion, the history of the long 20th century shows that an important point is to prevent the normalization not only of the state of emergency, but of the state of war as the origin of sovereign statehood. This development begins where the declaration of emergency is no longer necessary because state violence is not bound by legal and international order that explicitly serves to secure peace. It begins where exceptional regimes are hidden before the media and the eyes of intellectuals and the public, and where the project character of states, as Charles Mayer has called it, becomes mainly directed against enemies. It especially begins where the question of exception and rule is no longer asked. It begins then where emergencies are made increasingly invisible. In this respect, the moment in the US Congress when Democratic Representative Melanie Stansbury tried to make visible the totalizing intention of the Trumpian state of emergency, the moment which you can see on the photo, was an important one. It was a moment that displayed one of the thin yet existing lines that divide notions of emergency under democratic rule and notions of emergency under dictatorial and totalitarian rule. That is, the public insistence on a notion of normality as a counterpart. Thank you for your attention.